When I said that I would do today's talk about what you could expect from a new government on animal welfare related issues, I was really hoping that I would be standing here talking about what a Labour government would be doing. And we had a very good manifesto called Protecting Animals that had our specific animal welfare policies in. But instead, we're obviously in a position where we have a majority Tory government, not a very big majority, but a majority. And I'll get on to some of the bigger issues. I know you're probably all dying to talk about fox hunting, but I'll just talk through some of the other issues that we might expect from them first. So the one thing that perhaps the coalition government did do quite a lot of good work on was the illegal wildlife trade. So it led to the London Declaration on illegal wildlife trade. They've made some promises I'll come on to in a moment to extend that. So that was one tick. The things they obviously didn't do so well, the badger cull, which is now seen as not just unethical and inhumane, but also flies in the face of virtually all the scientific arguments, and the BVA and everyone is saying that culling badgers, and particularly free shooting, but other forms of badger culling, doesn't curb bovine TB. But the last government pushed ahead with that in the face of a lot of evidence to the contrary. They also reneged on a pledge to ban wild animals in circuses, and it doesn't actually affect very many animals. There's only, I think it's about 25, 26 or so big wild animals left in circuses in the UK. But they kept pushing it back. There was a backbench debate called by Conservative MP Mark Pritchard, where the government knew it was going to lose the vote. It wouldn't have been a binding vote, but in terms of a demonstration of the will of the House, it would have sent out a very clear signal that people thought that wild animals in circuses ought to be banned. And even like the Daily Mail, I think they'd actually kick-started a lot of the discussion. There was an elephant that was rather bizarrely named Anne the elephant, that had been discovered to be very badly mistreated in a circus. So when you've got the Daily Mail, the vast majority of the British public, and even most Conservative MPs on side, the government felt that it had to promise a ban. It didn't do it. It kept saying there wasn't parliamentary time. And in the last year or so of Parliament, most MPs were turning up 2 days a week, if that. There was very, very little serious parliamentary business to be done. There was plenty of time. You could have got it through the House in one day, and they didn't do it. They've now said in their manifesto they will do it. We obviously have to watch this space, but they won't have an excuse with 5 years to go. As I said a moment ago, most of the progress that was made under the last government was on the international front, and the Tory manifesto for this election is actually pretty good on international things. They're talking about banning or enforcing things like poaching, commercial whaling, making sure that there's not a resurgence of that, shark finning, ivory sales, bringing in endangered species status for polar bears. So that's all good stuff. Obviously, it's not as good when you start looking at the local record. Another thing they've said, which I think we need to sort of start switching our attention to quite a bit, is they talk about committing to high animal welfare standards when they come to renegotiating the Common Agricultural Policy, which is a couple of years down the line. Many of you already heard a bit about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Treaty between the EU and US, and a lot of the concern about TTIP today has been about the impact on the NHS. I mean, Labour certainly said that it would, that would be an absolute red line if the NHS wasn't taken out of that trade agreement, which could have opened the doors to NHS privatisation or selling off bits of it. We wouldn't under any circumstances be prepared to contemplate signing the treaty. That's obviously now still a risk that is on the table. But if you dig down beneath the details, and a lot of TTIP isn't in the public domain yet, there's a concern that it will lower environmental standards and lower animal welfare standards down to the lowest common denominator. If you're trying to bring all these EU states, plus the American states, the American federal government, possibly some of the states as well, into a trade agreement where they all act by the same rules, you should really be using an agreement like that to bring everyone up to the best possible level. And that goes for people as well, labour standards, terms and conditions, health and safety laws. It should be as good as it possibly can be, and a way of bringing other people into the fold. Instead, there's a danger that it becomes a race to the bottom, and the animal welfare standards, environmental standards, local autonomy on things like whether you want to allow GM crops, that could all fall by the wayside, and use of pesticides, things like that as well. There's a real concern. If you look at the debate about neonicotinoids and bees that was going on the last couple of years, it was our government who went to the EU discussions and said they didn't want a ban on neonicotinoids. So they're the sort of things that aren't necessarily out there on the front page of the Mail, like the elephant in the circus, but they are there and they're things that we need to lobby on. Another thing in the Tory manifesto says that they will press for all EU member states to only send animals to slaughterhouses that meet the highest animal welfare standards. We had a debate in Parliament recently about halal and kosher, and there was actually a Tory MP, Matthew Offord, who's back, and he's normally it falls to me to make the sort of what I call the mad vegan argument, obviously in quotes, but what was interesting is people listened with a lot of respect to the Muslim MP that put forward the Muslim arguments about halal. They listened with great respect to the Jewish MPs that put forward the arguments about kosher slaughter. And then when it came to this Tory MP saying that actually he wanted to talk from the animal welfare point of view, they all started, on the other side, obviously not my side, all started laughing at him and ridiculing him, as though, so a religious belief is fine and has to be respected, but a belief in animal welfare and not slaughtering animals doesn't have to be respected, which was, disappointing, obviously. One of the key things that we discussed during that debate was the need for CCTV in slaughterhouses, mandatory CCTV, and that's not something that the government will pledge to do. So that's something that we need to push them on, because I don't think you can ensure, highest animal welfare standards if you don't have CCTV monitoring what goes on. Another thing in their manifesto is about animal testing on cosmetics being tested on animals. Obviously the ban came in March 2013. They said they want to encourage other countries to follow the lead. At the moment 80% of the world still does test cosmetics on animals. The Chinese market is absolutely huge. So there's a lot of companies that are choosing to forego the EU market and market in China instead, and therefore they're still testing. They didn't meet, in the coalition agreement in 2010, there was a pledge to reduce the number of animals used in scientific procedures. That pledge wasn't met. The number of animals licensed for testing actually went up by 11%. So that's something else we need to keep an eye on. Then I'll come on to the bits that actually aren't mentioned in their animal welfare section, because they're not really anything to do with animal welfare. So they pledged to implement a 25-year strategy to eradicate bovine TB, which basically means rolling out the badger cull. Now, Liz Truss hasn't, who's the Environment and Food and Rural Affairs Secretary of State, hasn't yet said whether they will extend the pilot schemes this year. We know that the pilots in Gloucestershire and Somerset, although they were a complete failure last year, there's plans to move ahead with them. So that's obviously something we need to keep up the campaign on. I would say actually, in the last week, I've suddenly had a whole flood of emails, and the three issues are the badger cull, fox hunting, and stopping seal slaughter in the UK, which is primarily about up in Scotland. They've just started to have some coming through on the Human Rights Act, so which is a relief really, because it shouldn't just be about animals, and we need to be vigilant about other issues as well. But it does show that the public is already awake and alert to the threat that this government could pose. They talk in the manifesto about protecting hunting, shooting and fishing for all the benefit to individuals, the environment and the rural economy that these activities bring. Well, obviously, if you look at something like grouse shooting, 47 million birds a year are imported or bred here for shooting. Half of them die before they're even shot because they're kept in such appalling conditions. It's not a conservation activity. They are actually, the only reason these birds come into existence is so that they can be released to be shot. And as I said, 47 million, at least 30 million are actually shot, and they're kept in battery cages. One of the things Labour I would have very much liked to see a ban on all cruel sports. I'm Vice President of the League Against Cruel Sports, but in the Labour manifesto they at least had a pledge to look at the welfare of game birds, to rule out battery cages, to stop these 20 million or so birds dying before they're even shot. That's obviously not something the government's going to do. And then I come on to the big one, a free vote on reversing the Hunting Act. And if I just talk a little bit, and then perhaps we can have a discussion about the the numbers game on this. They would have done it in the last Parliament if they had had the numbers. It's very clear that David Cameron, his father-in-law is a very keen hunter. Cameron himself is, he was a very good stag hunter apparently. There's this trick where you shoot 2 stag at once, you just go pow pow, and he's managed to do that, and that's considered a badge of honour within those circles. But personally, he feels very strongly, and it's almost like an emotional thing about bringing back fox hunting. They didn't have the numbers to do it in the last Parliament because they didn't have a majority. Nearly all the Liberal Democrats were against it. Plus, I think it's about 28 Tories in the end. There's an organisation called Blue Fox, which is Conservatives Against Fox Hunting, and they had about 28 MPs that were signed up to support them, and they tended to be the same ones that were opposed in the Badger Cull as well. So the numbers didn't stack up for them. What they tried to do in the last year was to seriously weaken the Hunting Act by the back door with a statutory instrument that would have gone through almost on the nod without people noticing, that would have increased the number of dogs that could have been used to get foxes out of their holes when they become a nuisance. So when it was seen as very much as pest control. And they said that the Welsh hill farmers were demanding it, and they put up a Liberal Democrat MP who was a Welsh hill farmer to push it forward and say this is very much about protecting our sheep. And it wasn't, it was just a way of trying to undermine the Hunting Act. And if anyone tells you that the Hunting Act needs to be got rid of because it doesn't work, it is actually the most successful piece of animal welfare legislation that has ever been introduced. In terms of, there's been about 400 prosecutions, but in the proportion of cases that actually proceed from being investigated, being taken to trial, and then the success rate of trial, is a very successful piece of legislation. It could be better enforced, it could be tightened up, but it is an act that absolutely works. So they will bring in, I'm about to finish in, so we'll bring in that, but they will, so they're going to bring in a free vote. In terms of the way the numbers stack up, they have got a majority of, I think, 22 in this Parliament, but you could add I think I should have checked my numbers before I came out, there's about 8 DUP MPs from Northern Ireland that are likely to vote with them. There's Kate Hoey on our side, unfortunately, who will vote with them, and then maybe 1 or 2 Liberal Democrats, I'm not sure. There's only 8 Liberal Democrats left. The ones that were best on animal welfare were people like Adrian Sanders from Torbay, Martin Horwood from Cheltenham, Andrew George from St Ives. All of them lost their seat to Conservatives, unfortunately. I used to work with them quite closely on animal welfare issues, so unfortunately we've lost them. But the numbers, the thing that really makes a difference to numbers is if the SNP MPs, we now have 56 Scottish Nationalist MPs in Parliament who are, in theory, very much opposed to the fox hunting, supported the ban in Scotland. They are saying that it's, at the moment the line is, it's an English matter and it's an English law, and they aren't going to vote on purely English matters in the Westminster Parliament. So that means that there are, that's 56 MPs that wouldn't be voting against the hunting ban. That means we'd be looking for about 90 Tory rebels. We aren't going to get 90 Tory rebels. I'm hoping that the new intake, some of them are good on animal welfare issues, but we don't know about that yet. But we're probably, if we can get the SNP on board, we'd be looking for about 30, which we might manage. If we don't, we're going to need about 90, and it's unlikely to happen. So the 2 things that need to be done is, 1, to put real pressure on the SNP to actually, they've been elected to take part in a Westminster Parliament that votes on all sorts of issues, some of which just cover England, some of which cover the whole UK. Some things that we vote on would only cover London, like say the Crossrail bill, but you're there to represent the people of the UK as a whole. So we've got to try and put pressure on the SNP to actually vote with us on that, and then we also need to try and find as many Tory MPs as possible. So if you live in an area with a Tory MP, you ought to be sort of writing to them, emailing them, but try and get a meeting with them at their constituency surgery, try to get them to nail their colours to the mast. It will be a free vote, so that means even if they're a minister, they'll be able to vote against it. It will be seen as an ethical issue. So that is the big challenge. The Queen's speech is next Wednesday. There's some talk that fox hunting won't be mentioned in the Queen's speech because Cameron doesn't want all the coverage in the following days to be about fox hunting, but it will still come in, it will still be introduced early in this Parliament. It doesn't have to be mentioned in the Queen's speech to happen. So the chances are we could be looking at this huge battle in the forthcoming months. So it is a battle that we can win because the public is, figures are around 75%, 80% are opposed to fox hunting, and it's exactly the same in rural areas as it is in urban areas. So the public is against it. It's just that unfortunately the Conservative Party by and large isn't. But we need to make sure that we win over those wavering MPs and Scots. Okay, I'll leave it at that. So Ian, you wanted to come in?
Yes.
Do you need the mic? Or?
I'll speak up. With respect to the high success rate of prosecutions under the Hunting Act, may that be because, with it being under-enforced, only the best cases get taken to court?
You might be right in the, but actually in terms of cases that are referred to the police, though, as I understand it, there's quite a high, it's not like, say, if you look at the hideous statistics for rape convictions, for example, there's massive underreporting of rape, but then when cases are referred, there's also a very poor rate in terms of taking it forward for prosecution. But I think in terms of hunting, there's a good rate as well of, once it's reported to the police, actually them taking it forward. So. Anyone else? Yeah, right at the back. Yeah.
It's a decision on mine, I think, for the SNP, try and get them to consider an ethical issue and not a audit issue. So a lot of these people can go out there and sign that.
Yeah.
Try and get them to get involved with it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Online petition to get the SNP to vote with us is really good. Yeah. We have a Scot.
On that point, the SNP are correct. Fox hunting is traditionally mainly in England, but there were still are Scottish fox hunts as well. So it's not purely English.
Yeah, but what they're saying is it's because it's a devolved matter. They passed their own laws to stop fox hunting in Scotland, and this law, the Hunting Act that we're talking about, the Tories trying to repeal, only applies to England and Wales. So yeah, it's just, and the problem is if we force, I think the sheer power of public opinion, and there's a lot of people that voted for the SNP and wouldn't have expected them to do something like this. So a lot of people in their own constituencies won't buy this argument that it's just, well, Scottish foxes are okay, they want English foxes to be protected as well. But if the SNP do agree to do it, it then means that every time we need their support on something like, say, the NHS, that's a devolved matter as well. If we're trying to bring in something that we think will help protect the NHS from further privatisation, they'll just say, well, it's not us, it's devolved. And education, it's not us, it's devolved. So you'll then have a whole block of MPs that won't, we used to have 6 SNP MPs that didn't vote on those issues, but to have 56 is obviously a lot more significant. Yeah, Julie.
Hi, Kerry. I was wondering if you could say something about the government and their food policy. I mean, I don't know if you want to move on finish off fox hunting first, but I'm interested to hear what you've got to say about that.
Were you going to say that?
Yeah, Victoria from Ken and Angels. I just want to know if the Labour Party will work to get a better dog breeding, trading legislation as a key to tackling abandoned dogs and poor welfare.
Okay, well I'll do that one first because that's quicker than the food policy thing. Again, that was one of the main pledges in our animal welfare manifesto. I've got to know Mark Abrahams, the TV guy. He's in Parliament as much as I am. I swear, everything I ever go to, Mark's there. And again, that's something that's got cross-party support. It ought to. So it's partly about banning puppy breeding, intensive breeding, reducing the number of litters that a dog's allowed to have, but licensing dogs so that breeding dogs so that we can keep track of how many litters they have.
Yeah.
But then there's the online trade as well, which
I
is
think it's
a
very
huge issue.
happens.
Yeah, because that's far more difficult to stamp out. But yeah, we're totally behind it. I don't know what's in. I didn't spot anything in the Tory manifesto on it, but I think that's something where cross-party action is, again, I got hundreds of emails about the debate that we had in Parliament last time. So on food policy, God, where to start? I just have real concerns, and I sort of tend to say this every year at Vegfest, that the government is completely enthralled to the large-scale food manufacturers and the large-scale farmers. We've actually got someone, Bill Wiggin, who's a dairy farmer, an MP, who was beginning to move the right way. He chairs an all-party group on dairy farming, so he was very pro-badger coal. And then Brian May has been working on him, He even took him to a Queen concert in January to try and win him over. Because he invited a bunch of us, and there was about 8 of us that were all like, defend the badgers lot. And it was like, what's Bill Wiggin doing here? And Brian was like, I'm working on him. And he was starting to sort of be persuaded of the merits of vaccination. But Bill has just emailed me because he wants to be elected chair of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. And in it he put, in fact one colleague said I was the parliamentary branch of the NFU. I thought that was a good thing. And I don't actually want that committee to be chaired by someone that just represents the National Farmers Union, because it's only by and large the big farmers that are in there. They're very pro-badger coal, they don't listen to the evidence, there's all sorts of other reasons, the push towards intensive farming, all sorts of other reasons why I don't want the chair of that committee to just be coming at it from the NFU angle. We see the same, we've just had a new DEFRA minister appointed in the Lords, who again is a farmer. He receives an awful lot in the way of EU farming subsidies, and that's one of the things that I've said in the past, that if an MP or a minister or off the Lords gets capped subsidies, that ought to be declared in the Register of Members' Interest, because we have to declare if we own shares, if we own property, if we get rental income, any other source of income, if we're a director, if we're a consultant. I'm none of those things. But if you have to declare that because it might influence what you do as an MP, surely if you're someone who owns lots of land and you're getting subsidies from the EU for that land, that is going to have an impact, particularly if you're a DEFRA minister that may be taking part in these negotiations. So there's a big issue there. I think there's also, so there's an issue on the farming side. I'm chair of the all-party agroecology group, which is trying to sort of push the case for more sustainable, local forms of farming. But with the big food manufacturers, I mean, there was something just in the last week where a Tory MP, I can't remember who, but was calling for a crackdown on sugar levels in food. And then the minister almost immediately ruled it out. And if you look at, in my view, some of the big food lobbyists are as bad as the tobacco or the alcohol industry lobbyists in terms of trying to present a false case for, we are being sold things that are very, very bad for us. And under the guise of people being able to make the choice, they are, they're still able to sell these things. So I think it's partly about transparency and people knowing what they're buying and being educated about, as you saw with the horse meat scandal, being educated about what horribleness is in some of the food that you eat. But I think it needs to go further than that, because a lot of people aren't in a position to know that, they're not in a financial position to make a judgment, they might not live in the right geographical area to be able to shop around. And I think there's a huge amount to be done. I was looking up yesterday, it was a slight sort of tangential thing, but there's a band that I like called the Silver Jews, and the singer is called David Berman, and he declared a few years ago that his father was the devil. This is a US band. So I ended up looking up his father on in Wikipedia, and his father is one of the top Washington lobbyists, and there's a page called Berman Exposed as well, a website, Berman Exposed, and he basically spends his whole life setting up front groups that then challenge animal welfare legislation, challenge tobacco laws, challenge drink laws, challenge anyone who's trying to combat the fast food industry. Whole bunch of front things, and it's quite scary. It doesn't happen to quite the same extent in the UK. I do think we need to be very aware that some of these stories you see placed in the press about trying to ridicule some of the health claims for some products and trying to say that milk, for example, is incredibly good for you. We need to be aware that there's very large commercial interests behind them, and that's one of the things that I want to do. It's quite a depressing thing, being back in Parliament and thinking, God, we've got another 5 years of opposition ahead of you. And because in opposition, you say you don't do for the most part. You can try and win some votes, but it's difficult. And so a lot of it is about saying things and highlighting things. And one of the things I want to try and at least make some inroads in is this issue of the role of the food and farming lobby, and how we can sort of have healthier public procurement in prisons and schools, for example, exposing what actually goes into the food, banning some of the things that goes into food that shouldn't be in our food. And, you know, I think maybe, you know, even though I'm in opposition, I can maybe make some inroads into that.
I was wondering, when people contact SNP MPs, perhaps with the additional handicap of not being constituents, I mean, you've met the SNP MPs, what would actually convince them to vote on a devolved matter?
Right. Okay, well, Parliament's only been back a few days, so I've only met a few of them. There's about 150 MPs, I think, are new this Parliament. 53 of the Labour MPs are new. About the same for the Tories, and then about the same for the SNP. So there's a lot. We've only been in the chamber once, which was the election of the Speaker, and you look around and think, who on earth are all these people? So there's a lot of work to be done getting to know what their views are. And it is better if it's a constituent that contacts them. And it's better if the constituent doesn't use the 38 degrees or the change or the abad type method. I quite like getting those emails because it shows the strength of feeling on something. But there's a lot of MPs that don't answer them and don't answer names on petitions. They will answer if it's an individual tailored letter or email. And ideally trying to go along and see them. I think what we need to do is, as quickly as possible, get a database of what people have said. You know, so ideally, this was done quite well in the forests campaign. So I don't remember, but back at the beginning of the last Parliament, the government was talking about privatising the national forests. And there was a huge campaign, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of emails some MPs received. But there was a website where they published the responses that they got from the MPs as well, which was quite good because then you knew if an MP was going to, you know, was saying one thing, it was better, you know, ammunition to stop them voting a different way, and you quote some of the lines back at them. So I think that would be useful. So we need to do that mapping, if you like, of where people stand. But in terms of the Scots, I think what it needs is the Scottish electorate who voted all these SNP MPs in to be saying to them, we voted you to do a particular job, and that is to vote against. Yeah, because especially the dynamics, we know that people who voted for the SNP weren't voted, by and large, weren't voting for a Conservative government. They wanted an SNP and Labour type left alliance that would combat the Tories. So if they're going to abandon Labour in there, you know, when we are trying to do the right thing, so it's putting all that pressure on them. But it's partly about the sheer scale of the public effort, I think, that will manage to win them over. I know that already, you know, they're being, well, we need to consider it on a case-by-case basis, we need to think about this. It does partly depend what Cameron promises them, though, in terms of further devolution, you know, behind the deal scenes. If they say, well, if you don't vote on this issue because it's English votes for English laws, then we'll do this and we'll do that. And we've got to be vigilant that that's not happening.
Who are the sympathetic Tories to join Muslim?
Sympathetic Tories. The one that isn't is Neil Parish, who is also trying to become chair of the Select Committee, I think, and runs the All-Party Animal Welfare Group, and he's down in Tiverton, and he's pro-hunting and pro-badger cull, which is why I don't go to meetings of the Animal Welfare Group. I was thinking Mike Weatherly was good, he stood down. Tracy Crouch, who's now the Sports Minister, she's been really good on badgers and fox hunting. Anne Main from St Albans was one of those who changed her mind on the badger cull and actually led a debate on it, which was quite powerful because, yeah, it wasn't the usual suspects, it was somebody who had been thought that culling was probably the right answer. I don't know where she is on fox hunting, but I would have thought she's pretty good. Matthew Offord again, who I mentioned from Hendon, will be good.
Is that Matthew?
Matthew Offord. There's a new Tory MP who beat Ed Balls. She's vegetarian, so that's quite a good sign. Do you know any more on the badger side? I think my mind's got a bit blank on some of them.
Dominic. Right.
Oh, Dominic Raab. Oh, right, okay, Dominic Raab, yeah. So I said Mike Weatherly Post stood down, he was good. But if you look at Blue Fox, there's a Blue Fox website, that will tell you who the ones in the previous Parliament were and whether they're still on board. And I said we need to do an audit of the new ones. And anyone who lives around here, I know someone's been tweeting Charlotte Leslie to ask her what she thinks, and she won't reply. So all work on Charlotte. You're probably not going to get very far with Jacob Rees-Mogg or Liam Fox or whatever. But Chris Skidmore in Kingswood. There's a new Tory guy that's just beat Steve Webb in Thornbury and Yate, and Charlotte Leslie in Bristol North West. Let's try and flush them out, to use a hunting analogy, at a local level, and see whether we can persuade them. So, but like I said, there's lots of new Tory MPs, all Joe Bark is a new Tory MP as well, that will all be to Liberal Democrats. Julian.
I was going to ask about opportunities for collaboration with Charlotte Leslie, our Bristol North West MP as well, and also about the Food Standards Agency was another question.
Right, so collaboration with...
Yeah, Charlotte Leslie, I mean, where are the areas of common...
I've not heard her talk about these issues. We had an animal welfare hustings at Cafe Kino for the election, and it ended up just being me, one of the Green councillors, and the woman who was standing as an independent for Bristol. So they couldn't, across the whole of Bristol, get a Liberal Democrat or a Tory to come along. Or I think UKIP was going to come, and yeah. So I've not debated her on any of these issues, but like I said, I mean, really it needs to be her constituents that sort of ask her about it. And the same goes really for the bigger environmental stuff. I've not really heard her say much on that. You said on the food standards side, yeah. I mean, the food standards stuff, it partly goes back to this narrative or this ideological divide between people who think that regulation actually protects people and can make life better, and people who think regulation is the devil's work. And we saw this with the last government, like the bonfire of the Quangos. They would talk about any form of regulation as red tape. Whereas actually a lot of what they describe as regulation is things like the minimum wage legislation, protecting health and safety at work, or the environmental laws. So I think we've got to see what's in the Queen's speech next week, but I think we will see another push towards watering down controls over things. One of the things locally in Bristol, and some of this stuff does depend on the mayor. Apologies if we're not from Bristol. We have an independent elected mayor in Bristol who's up for re-election next year. And I've been to see him, and we agree pretty much on the food agenda, but there's one thing about agreeing, there's another thing in actually pushing for action. So if you look at the statistics, Bristol is pretty bad on the food inspections side and the food standards side. We don't carry out the sort of work that we should be doing, and I met with Which to discuss this. And I met with George, and he sort of said that doesn't look good, but we haven't really moved on from there, to be honest. Other thing is food waste, which I've done a lot of campaigning on. There's a report that came out yesterday that said that Britain is the worst for food waste in the EU, and people are starting to say, "Oh, we've done such great work." Actually, we have done some good work, but still, like about a third, maybe even as much as 50% of the food that is grown in this country is wasted, and that's something where Bristol was asked to be the leading food waste city by RAP, and turned down the opportunity to do that because they thought they were good enough already. So again, that's something I've been pushing for more action on. It's pretty scandalous when you've got 1 million people using, or 1 million food bag users a year, for so much of that food that's grown to just be chucked away. And we need to do a lot more on that. France, I was told when I introduced a food waste bill, and I was told that EU food safety legislation wouldn't allow us to proceed with it. And I got 2 legal opinions from organisations that volunteered to do it for nothing that said otherwise. France has now just introduced a food waste bill that is pretty damn similar to the bill that I was trying to get through. It's basically saying supermarkets have to give edible food away to people who can eat it, and if it's not edible for humans, to livestock and so on, rather than just burying it in landfill or sending it to anaerobic digestion. So France can do it, and again, this has only come up in the last couple of days. They want to look at the French legislation. If France can do it, then the UK can do it. So that's something we need to push for. Anything else? Right, well, thanks for coming here and eat lots of food.